The provincial election on October 6 is an opportunity for each of us to exercise our democratic responsibility as Ontario citizens. Our votes will elect people and political parties to represent us here at Queen's Park for the next 4 years. ISARC, along with other faith communities, is concerned about social justice and economic equity. We want to make sure that poverty is not overlooked, but remains an issue on the agenda throughout the provincial election campaign. Through this video, we'll hope to raise awareness about issues of poverty and to help you build relationships with politicians in your communities.
ISARC stands for Interfaith Social Assistance Reform Coalition. It began as an advisory committee to the provincial government when the government did its previous social assistance review back in the mid-1980s. And at that time, the advisory committee of religious communities came forward to work with the government to give them some advice.
So one of the important pieces about this book that I want to let you know, and in 2010, ISARC conducted social audits in 26 communities in Ontario, where we listened to the voices of real people living on low income. These audits identified 4 main issues: improvements to the social assistance system, finding meaningful employment, adequate and affordable housing, and the building of strong communities.
At this time in Ontario, in 2011, adults who each month go through what we call monthly cycles of chronic hunger. Money is there for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then money starts running out. And when money runs out, pangs of hunger set in. Let's look at getting a healthy food supplement for all adults on social assistance of at least $100 a month. It wouldn't make social assistance adequate, but it would show that there's recognition that people, adults living on social assistance, are having serious problems.
They are asking faith communities, help me. And many are embarrassed even to come because up to yesterday they were earning good wages. Today they don't have wages, they have to wait for the EI will not be enough. So they are even embarrassed to come and say, hey, I was working, living a good life, and now I'm standing in the line of the poor. They would rather starve, they feel, because that is not below their dignity to go in the food line.
Sometimes the accusation is made that there are people who are just lazy and they don't care and they just want to live off the system. And my answer to that would be, of course, there's always somebody. You can always point to someone who abuses the system. But does that mean that for the 99% of the other people who are struggling, that you damn them with that same kind of reputation or smear them with that stereotype? In fact, we set people up to fail in the system we've got, right? We give them less than they need, and then at the end of the month we blame them for having not survived, even though we know that they can't.
A number of people, I think, that are more vulnerable to finding themselves without work, it's all over the place. It doesn't matter where you are now, what industry you're in, what sector. So it's tight across the board. So to just say, go get a job, it's not realistic. Go get a job while you're going to take care of my child while I work shift work for $11 an hour. And how can I get a job? I don't have a home. I have no teeth. Like there's any number of issues that prevent people from doing more for themselves. Folks that are on OW and may not have the skill set, may not have gone to university, and even those jobs, there's so many people looking. Everybody's looking for a job at Starbucks or StarTech right now. So when you have to go and get those jobs and childcare ends at 6:30 and your shift ends at 9, and the bus doesn't come till 9:30 or 10, what do? Encourage people that are going, that are running to be policymakers, get them to go into those communities. Don't shy away from those communities. I'd challenge them to go into those communities. They have a lot of explaining to do.
It makes absolutely no sense that when people seek to improve themselves through employment, that we reduce their income on social assistance so they can't get out of poverty. They are given a small exemption, and then their income, rather, on social assistance is reduced by the amount of their earnings. This is immoral. When people are trying to earn their way out of poverty, there ought not to be a penny of social assistance reduced, until the earnings and the social assistance income begin to approach a poverty level. That's what collective responsibility is about.
We've done a lot of research over the years which looks at the many, many links between poor housing and poor health. Some of those links are biomedical, so we know, for instance, poor housing tends to have a number of physical conditions like mold, like maybe inadequate cooling in the summer, inadequate heating in the winter, and all those lead to respiratory diseases, to circulatory diseases, and so on, higher prevalence of poor health. There's also mental health issues that are associated with poor housing. People who are poorly housed typically have a higher burden of stress. Here in Ontario, roughly 500,000 households are living somewhere in that danger zone where they're living in housing. It's unaffordable, substandard, overcrowded. We know there's, for instance, 130, 140, 150,000 households that are on affordable housing waiting lists across the province. And that those lists are actually growing longer and longer. They're actually an all-time record. I think the most important question to ask politicians in the upcoming provincial election, what are your specific targets? How many homes will you be prepared to fund? What kind of dollars are you going to put behind those? So ask the candidates to move from general sort of statements about isn't it terrible, that people are having trouble finding a good place to live, to very specific action-oriented statements about what are the numbers that you're prepared to commit for that.
I think in terms of a powerful community, it's finding the purpose, it's realizing your potential, and it's mobilizing, and it's coming together and forming numbers, because numbers are what people respond to, and a purpose is what people will stay on board for. What the government can do, and what I think is an issue in a lot of communities in terms of not keeping them as strong as they can be, is sustainability. And it's implementing procedures and different projects that implement sustainability. You come into a community and you give them $100,000 and you ask them to run a few programs with no follow-up, with no education, with no explanation as to how this is actually going to benefit people. And a year later, you're going to see the money gone and you're going to see people back at square one. So imagine if the government were to take the time to come into communities where people could learn about how they could, for example, low-income communities, they could learn about finances. And a lot of people in these communities most people are very educated. So not to create that stereotype, but in any community, it's to bring information in there, it's to educate, and it's to make people accountable for their own actions and to make them sustainable. You look at education, for example, part of the reason why so many students are in debt is because they don't know how to manage finances. If there were to be a mandatory program to ensure that young people knew how to use their OSAP, just that alone, investment, different things like that would ensure that we don't come out of school in debt looking for jobs and not wondering what we're going to do.
There are no grocery chains here. The only thing we have is small variety stores with high sodium, low nutrition food. We decided to pull some of the community partners together and say, hey, let's do something about that. And the community garden came up. We finally got permission to be here to use this vacant and unused and potentially never used again land. The opportunity for residents in the area to be able to lay in their own garden and get some support and grow their own food and not feel like they're doing it alone. And it also pulls together community members as well. Neighbors who may not knew one another can build some solidarity between them.
As a person of faith, I'd want to know that it's not my faith that I am promoting, but it's my motivation for what I'm doing and what I am speaking about comes from my faith. We care about our communities and we want them involved in the very real issues and in helping to find solutions to address some of those needs that aren't being adequately met.
This is an opportunity for the voters in Ontario to send a message to our politicians, no matter what party they belong to, that why the food banks line is increasing.
I think it's critical that faith groups, social community voluntary agencies are joining forces to say this is a critical issue and we want each of the 3 or 4 major political parties to make this a subject of concern and talk to us about what they plan to do over the next 4 years. I think what faith groups can do, and in every faith tradition, it seems to me this is a violation of human dignity in every major faith tradition, to compel fellow humans to live in states of such destitution and despair.
Approach all the candidates. Organize candidates meeting, special meeting on this subject. Approach them and says, what is your platform for dealing with poor and needy? How can we make Ontario poverty free? So now we really need to come together, and faith communities, it is part of the obligation as part of their scriptural guidance that yes, you have to look after the God's creation poor. But then the others need to step in, support the faith-based organization like ISARC, Multi-Faith Alliance to Homelessness, Flemington Food Bank, Consar Foundations, a number of others, the Toronto Working Group on Poverty, now called Alliance for Poverty-Free Ontario, Toronto. So there are a number of them working. We are appealing to everyone to support them financially so that we can continue to look after the homeless and the poor in the province.
Faith communities like St. John's Parish here in Parkdale neighborhood of Toronto have long provided charitable services in local communities, services that help people to survive on low incomes and help them to have a better life. Yet the prophets, traditions, leaders, and sacred books of these faiths have also called for building a world in which all people have the means to live a decent and secure life, a place where they can have the means to not only have dignity, but to be treated with dignity. Faith communities see the essentials of life: food, shelter, clothing, transportation, and community as the building blocks of this world in which all people can both maintain their self-respect and manage to care for their families. Poverty is a force that has destroyed human dignity. The persistence of poverty is an ethical and moral dilemma that must be addressed with deliberate speed and as a question of the highest priority. Now is the time to make substantive change. This election, we call on the government to act so that all people have dignity and are able to provide food, good housing, safety, and other determinants of health for their families and themselves. Take the time to learn more about the issues that relate to poverty and raise these issues with the politicians and candidates in your riding. In 2009, all three major political parties voted in the Poverty Reduction Act. Remind your politicians about the moral imperative within this legislation to remove poverty and to restore dignity within the lives of Ontario citizens.